Let's go! What time is it? Gator! Gator! It's gonna be a football game tonight now. No doubt. It's gonna be a football game here. Okay. I done been here before. All right, let's go, baby.
9. Rushing 4, ball comes out of the hands of Newton. It's on the ground, and it's still on the ground. Picked up by T.J. Ward at the 4-yard line. Vaughn Miller did it again.
Alabama back on top of the college football world.
Ladies and gentlemen, football to the max.
Your host, Sean Garmer, Gary Vaughn, and Randy Isbell.
Hello and welcome to another Football to the Max, the college football edition, previewing the Pac-12 conference. And boy, do we have someone that's going to talk to you all about the Pac-12, of course. Last Word on Sports Department, college football department head, Tony Siracusa is back. He was at the Pac-12 media days, so we talk a lot about that. And of course, preview the conference as well once we get through all that. But Gary, another conference to look at here.
Yeah, and it's really cool that we have someone who was actually available and at that conference meeting day. And, you know, this has been a lot of fun. It really has, getting in depth in every college football division and conference and figuring out what they're all going to be, what they're going to be doing this upcoming season, and just kind of really coming down to a big understanding of what this college football season is going to look like in general. So I've had a lot of fun with this. This is just, you know, something that's just been a lot of change for us because we haven't covered college football to the extent we are now. But it's a welcome change, and I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, certainly. So Randy is not with us right now. He's closing at work. This interview is almost an hour long, but let me tell you, there is plenty of stuff to sink your teeth into about the Pac-12 Media Day, about each of the big teams in the conference that are going to be contenders or possibly winners of the divisions and all that stuff. So it never lets down, I'll say that much. And, of course, we'll be back at the end of this interview to be able to give our standings and everything else. And hopefully Randy will be back by then and ready as well, because this is like the conference he has to hear a lot about, living in the Pacific Northwest and all that. So I'm sure he has a unique take on the teams and who he thinks is going to do well. So hopefully we get him here before we have to end the show. And if not, on the next one, he'll be able to give you his standings for that stuff. But all right, so here's Tony Siracusa, Last Word on Sports college football department head. So he is the main man over there to talk about college football with. Talking Pac-12 Media Day, the conference, who's going to win, everything, and so much more. Here we go. Hello, and I am here with Last Word on Sports college football department head, once again, Tony Siracusa. How are you doing?
Hey, Sean. Good to be with you again.
Well, you know, this is it's a special thing to get to go to one of these media days, and you were at the Pac-12 media day. Set the scene for people. Like, how is that?
I got to tell you, the Pac-12 media days are unlike any of the other conferences. Just as an example, you go to SEC media days, and it's in a big hotel in Hoover, Alabama, and the room is packed with media, and they all sit there politely, and the coaches come up to the podium and give a lengthy opening statement. They're up there for a grand total of 30 minutes, and you sit in the room. If you're meeting, you raise your hand, and they bring a microphone to you and call on you, and everybody hears what's going on. That's pretty typical of most conference media days. This is the West Coast, though. This is the Pac-12. We do things a little looser out here. First of all, the event is held in the same kind. It's called Hollywood and Highland, and if you're not familiar with the West Coast, it's where the Dolby Theater is, where they hold the Academy Awards. So we're already very West Coast, right? And there's this huge high-end shopping complex, outdoor shopping complex. It's like Beverly Hills, kind of shopping in this complex. And you have the top terrace area where there's a big ballroom up there, and the coaches come up, and everyone's seated in their seats, and the coaches come up and they'll make an opening statement, and then they'll say, come on up if you have any questions. And so literally you have 50 to 100 media people getting up out of their chairs, going to the front of the stage, and just shouting out questions until the coaches answer them. And then you can go downstairs, actually, where there's a huge courtyard, and it's where the Pac-12 network sets up their interview area. And you have coaches out there playing games outside and posing with, the trophies for the conference championship trophy, the Rose Bowl trophy, and having fun and interactive games with the players. I mean, it really could not be more Southern California compared to the rest of it. So it's a little bit of chaos. It's a little bit of strangeness. It's a little bit of a chill, relaxed atmosphere. It's very Southern California.
What was your favorite part?
Well, I got to tell you, look, I mean, any reporter who tells you they don't love Mike Leach from Washington State is just not being honest. The guy is a reporter's dream. Ask him one question and sit back for 5 minutes and let him just go on this random thought process with no telling where it ends up. I mean, at one point, I got to tell you, Leach has always been a character. When he was at Texas Tech, certainly up in Pullman, he's every bit the character. Someone asked him at one point what he thought of his players playing Pokemon Go. Now, in what world anyone would imagine that Mike Leach knows what Pokemon Go is, I don't know, but someone asked him. And Leach said, I have no idea what that is. And someone just they didn't walk him through it, but they were going to their phone and talking about what it's like. Leach went on for 5 minutes about how this is the end of Western civilization. Leach went on about how it's terrible that we're so attached to our phones and people will walk into a room and go to opposite corners just so they could text each other, and we're no longer civil to each other. And is as Pac-12 Commissioner Larry Scott is my witness, Leach ended his little monologue by saying, we were all better off when we used to have dirt clod fights at construction sites. Society was better off. That, wow, ladies and gentlemen, is Mike Leach. He is an absolute character. His opening statement, again, most of the coaches, at some of the other conference media days, the coaches will get up, give 5, 10, 12, 15-minute, things, and then answer their questions. Matter of fact, last year, Les Miles from LSU at the SEC media days gave a very, very well-remembered speech because he didn't feel like answering questions, and he knew that they keep it at a tight 30 minutes. So he went on a 20-minute-long opening statement talking about his vacation and going fishing, and he's got a daughter playing softball and what the team's record was like because he didn't feel like answering questions. At the Pac-12 media days, the opening statements are maybe 5 minutes long. If they go 10, they're being really verbose. Mike Leach doesn't want to do this. So Mike Leach went up, and the moderator of the event said, all right, Coach, we're ready for your opening statement. And Mike Leach said, here's my opening statement. Does anyone have any questions? Because he didn't want to give an opening statement. And so the media just got up out of their chairs and put their bottled water down for a few minutes and walked up to the stage to start talking to Coach Leach. He is a sports reporter's gem. There is never a dull moment around this man. So it was quite the 2 days at the event. You got some coaches who are a little staid, a little, kind of reserved, and then you got guys like Leach, or you got guys like Rich Rodriguez at Arizona, Because he gets up there and he said, I realize everyone's saying they're glad to be here. I'm going to tell you I'm not. I'd rather be on vacation still. Okay, good. We're off and rolling now, Coach. Let's get to it. So it's quite the collection that the Pac-12 has.
Is there anything that you particularly didn't like, or that was a bit hard getting used to?
Well, I got to tell you, outside they had catered event for the meeting. The media loves their free food, and they had ice cream that was themed by Pac-12 teams. So they had the UCLA Bruins ice cream, and it was vanilla ice cream with blue and gold sprinkles in it. It was very unimaginative. So sure, why not? There's my complaint. No, look, it's typical in the sense that they open up the event with the commissioner giving about a 20-minute speech on what's going on. And the Pac-12 has a lot of challenges, mostly around the Pac-12 network. It is not a good network. It is not picked up by DirecTV, which, of course, is one of the biggest providers in all of California. So if you have DirecTV, you can't get the Pac-12 network, even though DirecTV is now owned by AT&T, and AT&T U-verse carries it. So there's a lot of problems with the Pac-12 network. The teams have never gotten the money that they were promised when the network launched because there isn't the coverage, there isn't the clearance. And so there are a lot of challenges, but, the commissioner gets up, tap dances around that, and then you get on to the coaches, and the coaches always have two players with them. The strangeness is the two players are in the back of the room at tables. At the same time, the coach is in the front of the room. So sometimes you got to kind of choose, do I want the coach or do I want the player? But the Pac-12 is usually pretty accommodating. They will, if there's someone you want, when it's all said and done, they'll pull them aside and go find some room for you to meet with someone, on your own if there's someone you missed. So the conference is pretty fan friendly and pretty accommodating to the media.
So you said the network is pretty bad. So the ACC network that just was created or made, the Pac-12 should have probably partnered with somebody, right? Because that's where they kind of messed up.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the Pac-12 network wanted to go it on their own, and there isn't a network that needs me to carry their water for them or pitch for them. But the SEC went in and they were partnered with ESPN right away. And now the ACC has got the partnership, and the Big Ten Network has got a partnership, and the Pac-12 is trying to do it on its own. And, look, you've got major markets because you've got Seattle, you've got Los Angeles, you've got the Bay Area, you've got, Colorado, you've got Boulder, you've got Utah, but you're also having to find, people who are interested in Corvallis and in Pullman and in places like that. Not that easy, and they should have done the clearance before they really did the launch. They really should have worked harder on the clearance idea. Larry Scott was so sure that everybody was going to want to sign on, whether it was Time Warner or DirecTV or Dish Network or U-verse, that it would be a no-brainer. And that's just not the case. It's not the case at all. So they're missing a huge, huge audience number by not having all of the outlets locked in.
Yeah, that's a bit unfortunate. Apparently the kid is going somewhere and she decided to come in here, and hopefully she stays quiet. So of course not. So anyway, why didn't they? Were they just in a rush to get it to go, or?
I think that they were in a bit of a rush to launch because there had been financial guarantees made to all the universities based on the new network, and the universities, of course, were eager to have this additional funding that they were going to get with no strings attached to them directly. And there was that, but I also think, honestly, and I'm sure that Larry Scott will deny it, there was a lot of discussion with him about the network, and I'm sure he will deny it. I think some of it was just flat out ego. I think some of it was Larry Scott's misjudgment of what he was able to pull off. That on its own, with no branding partner like ESPN, that the Pac-12 network would still be big enough on its own. And it just is not. It really is not. It's a second-tier network right now. During football and basketball season, it's significant because you get some late-night West Coast games. You know, out here we call it late-night Pac-12. There's always some crazy game on, you know, it's finishing at 11:30 West Coast time, and you know, it's great, but the rest of the time, it really is an afterthought.
Is it potentially a problem if the schools don't get the money that they were promised?
I don't think so. I think because they've gotten enough of the money that there isn't going to be anything on their end that they're going to say, hey, this isn't working. Come up with something else. They've gotten enough of the money that they'll, without having to do anything really for it, that they're quiet on this. But there's grumbling about how it's not as big as it could be or should be. I don't think you would ever get a school administrator or an athletic director to go on record saying they're unhappy with it. But there's certainly, and you could hear it in the room at Pac-12 Media Days, that there's some underlying unhappiness that the network isn't as good as it could be or should be.
So now moving on to the Pac-12 itself as a conference. In general, I guess before we start, what do you think are the expectations of the conferences for this upcoming season?
I think you're looking at a Pac-12 North that is a little bit more open than in past years. I mean, you know, Stanford and Oregon have owned it for as long as anyone can think back off the top of their head. I think it's a little bit more open this year because I think Oregon is not going to be what they have been in the past. I think you're looking at a Stanford team that is still really good and really experienced, but, you know, has some holes to fill in. And I think Washington and Washington State are greatly improved. So I think the North is a little bit more wide open. I think the South is a two-team race. I think it's a USC-UCLA race with everybody else trying to catch up.
Yeah, and one of those teams that you talked about in the North seems to sort of be some people's sexy pick to win, in a Washington team that sort of kind of were on fire at the end of last season, and then they're kind of trying to take that last season and take it to this season. You see that happening?
Yeah, I think with Washington, what you're seeing, and it was funny, Chris Peterson in his opening statements was talking about how all of a sudden everybody has expectations for Washington, and people's expectations are high, and they're expecting a lot. And his comment was, it's amazing how much better we've gotten from December to now without playing a game, you know, relative to what everybody thinks we're going to be. And I think a lot of that has to do with, you know, they only went 4-5 in conference last year, so not great in conference, but they went 7-6 overall. You get a bowl win over Southern Miss, and they did it with a very young, very inexperienced team. And with most of that team back, obviously the expectations are going to be higher. You know, one of the keys that is going to be true for a lot of these teams is it's probably true across the country, but I think when you do a comparative analysis of the Pac-12 teams, first place you're going to look everywhere is the quarterback position. And, you know, Washington's got Jake Browning, and he was a true freshman last year, and he threw for just under 3,000 yards, and he had 16 touchdowns, and he had 10 interceptions. You're going to get the freshman mistakes, but he showed a lot of skill, and what he lacked in maturity, he had in physical skill, and he's back as a sophomore. They got a lot of depth at running back. They've got Myles Gaskin coming back. He ran for 1,300 yards last season. The challenge with their running backs is they're small. You don't have any bruisers. They're going to have to hit the outside. They're going to have to hit the corners. I think every one of their running backs is 5'11" or shorter. So it's you know, you can imagine what the running game is going to look like with that. They've got 1,500 yards worth of receiving yards coming back because they've got 6 wide receivers coming back. Plus, they have a guy that everybody's forgotten about, John Ross III, who was one of the leading receivers 2 years ago and was out last year with an injury. Probably one of the fastest guys in the league. So The offense truly is set. There's no reason why they cannot put up a lot of points. One of the things you look at from last year is they averaged 18 points a game in the 6 games they lost. They averaged 43 points a game in the final 3 games. Once they found that offensive rhythm and that consistency and that maturation that comes over the course of a season when you've got a bunch of freshmen and sophomores, and now they've got 9, 10 games under their belt, and all of a sudden they're kind of clicking on all those cylinders. They're going to have to be better in third down situations. They were 82nd in the country last year in third down conversions. But again, let's throw in some maturity. Let's assume some maturity, and I think Washington is going to have a good team. I think they're going to compete for the Pac-12 North.
So their rivals at Washington State, they kind of had a little bit of what Washington's going through this year, where people were expecting a lot more of them all of a sudden, and they still won 9 games.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see them? Are they still in the same area, or are they going to improve it more, or what's going on with Washington?
I think they're going to be. I think they're going to be what they were last year, with a potential little bit more upside. Last year was kind of strange because I don't think a lot of people knew what Washington State had, and Mike Leach says he wasn't really sure what he had in terms of ability. Remember, they lost the season opener to Portland State, and people were mocking them and laughing at them, and then they wind up going 9-4 overall, and they go 6-3. In conference. And the biggest reason, and for those outside the West Coast who've never seen this kid find a way to watch a Washington State game, quarterback Luke Falk is a beast. This kid threw for 4,500 yards. He's got an arm that apparently knows no pain or does not fall off, because he threw 644 passing attempts last year. It was crazy. And he did it at a 69% completion rate, 38 touchdowns, and only 8 interceptions. And that was his first full season as a starter. And he was a sophomore. Now, it was interesting because Leach was very open, being very upset that Falk was never a consideration for the Heisman with those numbers. And he said it's clear that the voting is provincial. And, he went on, again, ask him a question and get ready for the 5-minute answer. And his bottom line was, I don't even know what makes a Heisman candidate anymore when a guy like that has those kinds of numbers and doesn't get invited to New York. And his point was, he said, there are people, based on whatever's in the heads of voters these days, there are people who probably won the Heisman years ago who wouldn't even be a candidate anymore, because in Mike Leach land, all the parameters have changed. But seriously, this kid Falk is really something to watch. They've got 3 wide receivers back. So he's got his top 3 yard gainers from last year coming back. They've got a kid who's kind of an unknown coming in, Kyron Priester. He's a transfer from Clemson. He got kicked off the team at Clemson because Dabo Sweeney said that he had an attitude problem. But he was really, really highly touted. So, look, if you're going to go and have a second chance in football, Mike Leach is the kind of guy that's going to give it to you. So maybe it's the right place for him. They need to shore up their offensive line a little bit. They lost Joe Dahl to the NFL, so they need to shore up the offensive line. Their big opportunity for success is going to be their defensive line. Their defensive backs are fine. Linebackers are fine. They're not great, but they're good enough. But the run defense gave up 5 yards a carry last year. They got to improve on that, and if they do, then I think you're going to see them be in every game. Now, typical of Washington State, they've got a very weak out-of-conference schedule. I mean, they're playing Eastern Washington, Idaho, and then, they do have Boise State in Boise, so there is that. But, they typically don't play a difficult out-of-conference schedule. Mike Leach says it's because it's impossible to get big schools to do a home-and-home agreement and agree to travel to Pullman, Washington. It is way in the outskirts of anything you can imagine. So, they've got that easy out-of-conference schedule. They hit a 3-week period in October where they play Oregon, Stanford, and UCLA in consecutive weeks. That'll be the true test for them. They need to have improved their run defense and their defensive line by then to make a run.
Hey, you were talking about the quarterback too. I mean, there's got to be a little bit of a drop off with that. All right. I mean, he can't possibly do those numbers again.
I don't know. You know what? And I think that's the thing. Mike Leach doesn't pretend to have a running game. He's like, if I got a running back who's going to get me 60, 70 yards a game, great. I'm happy with that. He doesn't pretend to try and run a balanced offense. You know, I have no doubt that, you know, Falk is going to throw another 600 plus passing attempts this year. There's no reason to think anything other than that.
Yeah, I mean, that's I remember that being a thing with him at Texas Tech too. Just it was passing all the time. You know, even in situations where you're like, okay, it's a yard, y'all going to run, right? Like, oh no, we're just going to find a way. Pass the ball.
Hey, he'll go downfield on 3rd and 2, and he doesn't pretend to be anything other than that, you know. So I have no, you know, in terms of a drop off, look, is he going to throw for 4,500 yards again? Maybe. Is he going to have a 69% completion rate? That is maybe the one stat where you can see some drop off, because that's just an insane number for a sophomore college quarterback.
Fair enough. So, you know, the two that that you discussed as being the perennial guys that have owned this division, at least for the last 7 years, being the winners between the two. I mean, what David Shaw's been able to do at Stanford and just kind of keep them in that hunt for so long.
Mm-hmm.
They certainly lost quite a bit coming into this season. I mean, are they going to be able to do it again?
They did, and I think that common sense would say it makes them a little vulnerable, but I'm going to say that vulnerable at Stanford is relative. You know, look, they had a great season, 12-2, 8-1 in conference, trashed Iowa in the Rose Bowl. The media, the voting media, actually picked them to win the Pac-12 this year for the first time in 56 years. 56 years ago was the last time that Stanford was picked to win the Pac-12. David Shaw came in and said that just shows, addressing the media, he said that just shows exactly how little you all know. and because Shaw is trying to underplay it a little bit. Look, and again, we're going to see this theme throughout the conversation, quarterback. Stanford has had 2 quarterbacks total in the last 7 years. They've had Andrew Luck and Kevin Hogan for 7 years. So now you've got to choose between Keller Christ, who's a junior, and Ryan Burns, who's a senior, and they have a grand total of 10 passing attempts between them. So, you know, that's the unknown. That's the big what if. Now, of course, you got Christian McCaffrey in the backfield. And Christian McCaffrey, sorry, rest of the country, Christian McCaffrey should have won the Heisman last year. 2,000 yards rushing, another 1,200 in kickoff and punt returns, another 650 receiving. There's nothing the guy can't do. Shaw was asked if he was worried about McCaffrey having too much responsibility. He laughed. He said, "You kidding me? I'm going to give him some of my responsibility because I'm tired, but that kid just keeps going." You know, and he said he doesn't want to feel like he's putting the onus on McCaffrey just because they're going to be breaking in a new quarterback, but he said McCaffrey can handle whatever he gives him. You know, his point was, when you have a great player, you push him because he's going to lead everybody else by example. Now, again, you lost a quarterback that, you know, to the rest of the conference, it felt like Kevin Hogan had been there for 10 years. You know, you lose some skill position players. They lost Barry Sanders as the backup running back. They lost Devin Cajuste, a wide receiver. They lost, you know, Joshua Garnett and Kyle Murphy on the offensive line. They've got some holes to fill. But the thing with Stanford is they run a very measured offense. They run a very balanced offense. They're never asking too much out of one player on any series or even in one game, and they'll change it up from one game to the next. So it allows a kid like Solomon Thomas, who I think is probably going to wind up being, when his time is done, will be one of the best defensive linemen in the conference. He was already honorable mention last year. It allows this kid to step in. I have never liked the phrase in football, next man up, because I think that's kind of silly because, you know, who knows what the next man up is or how good they are. But I think Stanford has a lot of experience at the interior, at the linebacker position where, you're going to plug in the holes. You're going to run the same scheme and plug in the holes. I think they're a little bit more vulnerable than previous years. But, to quote, hey, you know what? I don't know if you ever saw the TV show The Wire, to me, the best TV show ever. So to quote D'Angelo Barksdale, the king stay the king. Until someone knocks them off, they're still that.
Yeah, The Wire, very awesome show. Agreed.
Sorry, I had to just throw that in there, Well,
no, I mean, people. There are still people that have not recognized the greatness of The Wire, and they need to do that.
Well, shame on them. Shame on them. They're wrong.
So, Oregon, of course, the team that people always love to talk about. It's got that, the history with, of course, those years with Chip Kelly and everything, and now Mark Helfrich has got to take this team and try to attempt to duplicate that. I mean, what's going on with Oregon?
I think Oregon's in a little bit of a transition mode, and here's why. This is going to be their second year in a row with a 1-year quarterback. They had Vernon Adams last year, was a transfer. They knew he was just there for the 1 year. They knew it going in, and even though the coaching staff wanted to tell you there was a quarterback competition, there wasn't. They always knew it was going to be Vernon Adams. There really isn't an obvious step in right now. You've got Dakota Prukop, who's a senior, transferred from Montana State. He was okay. Wasn't great. Wasn't lighting anybody up from Montana State. Or a freshman in Travis Johnson. That's it. Those are your two choices. And so it's not the easy transition. They had Marcus Mariota for years, and then they knew Vernon Adams was coming in. This is a little more dicey. It's a little bit more of a question mark. They're going to be without their top wide receiver for not most, but a lot of training camp, because Devin Allen is going to be at the Olympics in Rio. He qualified for the 110-meter hurdles. And as Helfrich said, that's a great excuse to miss training camp. It is, except when you're trying to break in a new quarterback. They'll have Royce Freeman coming back at running back. He's an 1,800-yard rusher, and they've got 3 starters returning up front. But they've got. I think for them, that transition at quarterback is probably more significant than some of the other teams we've talked about. They've got question marks on defense. They lost DeForest Buckner, of course, to the NFL. Really, their defensive line is going to be anchored by Henry Mondeau, which is fine, but even he's a converted tight end. So you got a lot of people. Every starting linebacker from last year is either gone, their eligibility is over, they moved on to the NFL, or they've switched positions. It feels like they have a lot more juggling going on than what is historically the case at Oregon.
I mean, so where do you think they're going to land here as far as?
I think they're going to battle for second. I think they're going to battle for second with Washington. I see Stanford having a slight edge over Washington State, and Oregon. I think it's a 3-way battle for second place. Stanford. The only thing that you're going to look at that could potentially trip up Stanford is the schedule. They open up against Kansas State at home. Then they've got a bye. But then in consecutive weeks, you've got USC at home, UCLA on the road, Washington on the road, Washington State at home. So they're 4 of the toughest games you're going to have in conference all year, and all in consecutive weeks. And then when they're done with that, they got to go travel to South Bend to play Notre Dame. But that 4-week period in September through the through the second week of October is going to be Stanford's test and their maturity and what they've pulled off at quarterback. If they get through that stretch, even with a loss, I don't think a loss hurts them. 2 probably does. But a loss doesn't necessarily hurt them, and they get through that with no more than that, then I think it's them and then everyone else battling for second. I mean, everyone else minus Oregon State, of course. No offense to the folks in Corvallis, but ouch. It's going to be another long season.
I was going to ask you just before we get to, you pretty much already told me you think Stanford's going to win
Right.
the division. Anything on California, Oregon State?
Look, I think Cal obviously has challenges in having to replace Jared Goff. It's not easy. You're also having to replace your offensive coordinator because Tony Franklin left for the same job at Tennessee. And Jake Spavital is a good coach, but having to bring in a new offensive coordinator, new quarterback, and the quarterbacks that you're looking at are not in-house. In other words, you're not boosting someone up who's been the obvious next guy. The likely choice is going to be Davis Webb, who's a transfer from Texas Tech, and he's got 5,500 career passing yards, and so he knows how to run a pace offense like Sonny Dykes likes to run at Cal. But again, they lost their top 6 statistical receivers, so I think their offense is in a bit of an overhaul. Last year at 8-5, it was their best record in 8 years, but there's a lot of unknowns on the offensive side of the football. One of the biggest surprises actually, Cal, was that Sonny Dykes even came back. I mean, I'm sure you remember during the off season, even towards the end during bowl season, his name was being thrown around for a lot of jobs. When people thought Tom Herman at Houston was leaving, all of a sudden they were already putting Sonny Dykes into the Houston job. Part of it was a surprise that Dykes is even back, that he came back at all. So they're talented, but they're very young with a lot of unknowns on offense. And then Oregon State, I mean, look, they lost 9 in a row to end the season with a 2-10 record. If you want to know how tough things are at Oregon State, I told you that all the schools bring 1 or 2 players. Oregon State brought their punter, Nick Borowski, to media days. That tells you how slim pickings it is up in Corvallis right now.
Wow. When you bring the punter,
When you bring the punter, there's not a lot of, and he was a nice young man. He's from Australia, had some great anecdotes. But as a head coach, when you're bringing your punter to conference media days, kind of tells you what kind of situation you're in.
All right, you talked about the South being the 2-horse race between the Southern California teams.
Mm-hmm.
Utah had a really good season last year. We're in that tie with USC. Will they be in any kind of contention, or see them drop?
Yeah, look, I think they'll be in contention. They had a great season. Like you said, 10-3 overall, 6-3 in the conference. Beat BYU in the Las Vegas Bowl, which if you're Utah, there's always an upside to that. But when you look at how much of their offense is gone, Devontae Booker, who was the best running back in the conference, and a 1,200-yard rusher, is gone. Quarterback Travis Wilson is gone. Your top 4 statistical wide receivers are gone. You've got some help at running back. They've got Joe Williams, who ran for just under 500 yards last season. He'll split some time with Troy McCormick. But now you're looking at, again, going back to our theme, the quarterback. Your choices really are Brandon Cox, who has been a backup all this time and hasn't made it through a season without injury, or a junior college transfer from Santa Monica College, Troy Huntley, who missed the spring game with an injury, or Tyler Huntley, who is a freshman. And he had a really good spring game, but the kid's 6'1", 175, and needs some physical maturation before he's ready to step in. And so those are some really big holes to fill. Their offensive line is experienced in its season. The defense lost all 3 linebackers, but if you've ever watched Utah, if you've ever watched Kyle Whittingham football, their defense is always very, very fundamentally sound. So the defense will be fine. The defense will keep them in games, but they basically lost all of their offensive production from last year, all of it. So they can compete when their defense can keep them in games and hold the score down. When they get into games where it turns into a little bit of a shootout, they're going to have problems. They're not going to be able to manage a fast-paced, catch-up from behind kind of offense.
Yeah, I mean, so at least, yeah, that's the problem is if you don't have the firepower to sort of compete with these two teams, it's going to be an issue.
Right, and even with teams like ASU, who lost a lot, of Arizona, they've got skill, but it tends to be fast-paced offense kind of skill, which Utah's going to have a hard time matching with as much as they lost.
So I mean, for a while we kind of already knew, USC is going to win this thing, and there's no competition. And then UC had the issues with where they had the restrictions put on them, and then UCLA started coming up more to the forefront. Which of these two teams do you think has the edge?
Wow, I think it's going to come down to a couple of factors, and I know it's going to sound like I'm dodging the question because I probably am. Is SC had a good turnaround year, even with all the tumult of last year with Sarkisian getting fired and bringing in Clay Helton, and now of course they lost the Pac-12 championship game, and then they lost in the Holiday Bowl to Wisconsin. And now Clay Helton is a permanent coach. And when I had a chance to sit down with Helton, I actually asked him, do you feel more pressure? Because the USC fan base wanted a big-name coach. And no offense, but they got you. And do you feel more pressure to have immediate results? And, in good coach speak, what Helton said was, hey, I just have to be who I am, and I can't stray from my game plan. But one of the things he did say is, I'm not a typical first-year coach because I got to ride the last half of last season as the interim. So I have a relationship with these guys, and I know who they are, and I know what to expect, and they know what to expect from me. So he doesn't see it as he's the first-year coach. He sees it as he's just the guy returning. They're likely – Under Helton, they're likely to go to more of a pro-style offense. We saw a little bit of that towards the end of last year, a little bit more, typical USC offense with the run game first and throwing the ball second. And I think you're probably going to see a little bit more of that because they've got to replace Cody Kessler at quarterback. The assumption has been for a year or two that it would be Max Brown, who's a redshirt junior. He's been kind of sitting around waiting his turn. Kid's good. I mean, he was the 2012 Gatorade National High School Player of the Year back in 2012. He's only thrown 19 passes at SC. In the spring game, this redshirt sophomore, Sam Darnold, had a huge game, and he really turned it into an actual quarterback competition to the point where Helton said that when camp opens, they're going to have at least 18 practices before he even thinks about naming a starter. So if you're Max Brown and you've been sitting there waiting your turn, you're probably not too happy to hear that. But, of course, Helton's got to do whatever he's got to do to win. They've got the running game. Like I said, they're going to be heavy run. Justin Davis and the guy they call Rojo, Ronald Jones II, are going to be very good. They're big up front. They've got this kid, Zach Banner, who is 6'9", 340 pounds. I stood next to him in the lunch line at one point during the Pac-12 media days, and he told me he dropped 40 pounds. So he's going to be quicker. And you know what? When you're 6'9", 340, you be whatever you want to be, and I'll just nod my head and say, yes, that's fine. They've got a good wide receiver in Juju Smith-Schuster. They don't have a lot beyond him. What they really need is someone else to step up so that defenses can't key on him so much. Their defensive backfield, really good. Adoree Jackson, Amon Marshall. Jackson, actually, they thought they were going to be missing him during camp because he made it to the U.S. Olympic trials in the long jump, but he finished 5th, so he's not going to Rio. And when I talked to him, he said he's already made the transition to football. He said it took him like 2 to 3 days, and that was it. He's already back in football mode. They've got questions on the defensive line, and that is going to be the challenge for them. They were already thin at defensive line, and then Kenny Bigelow tore his ACL in spring, and he's out for the year. So they're going to be relying on 2 guys, Rasheem Green, and Noah Jefferson, who've got limited experience. So their defensive line is going to be a challenge, and that will be the question mark with, of course, as we keep saying, whatever quarterback that you want to take a look at. UCLA, I got to be honest with you. This is going to be an interesting year for Jim Mora. He went 8-5 last year. They went 5-4 in conference. They lost 3 out of the last 4, including losing, a third-tier bowl game, the Foster Farms bowl game. No offense to the Foster Farms chicken people, but it's not one of the premier bowl games. And the fan base is not happy. They are grumbling. He got what most of the media saw as a contract extension through this, but when you actually read through it, what he got was new terms on his contract, which were basically a lot of incentive clauses based on winning the Pac-12 South, winning the Pac-12 championship, going to certain bowl games, having a certain graduation rate. So he's really the idea if he got a contract extension and therefore he's on firm ground is really not the case. He's got to produce this year. He's got to have a better year. He's not on the hot seat, but his seat's going to be pretty darn warm if he doesn't finish better. They've got Josh Rosen, obviously, coming back to quarterback. He's a true sophomore. Had a really good season, 3,600 yards and a 60% completion rate. He threw 11 interceptions, 3 of them in one game against BYU because, his thought was he's got a really terrific arm and he can thread the needle like nobody else. Well, welcome to big-time college football. This isn't high school anymore, and they're bigger, faster, and stronger on the other side. The other thing with UCLA that's going to be significant to watch is an overhaul of the offensive scheme. Noel Mazzoni had been their offensive coordinator. He left for Texas A&M, and it was met with great fanfare in Westwood at UCLA. Because last year you saw UCLA with Josh Rosen, who was not fleet of foot at all, trying to run the same kind of offense that they ran the year before with Brett Hundley, who is very fleet of foot. With Hundley, the teams had to leave a linebacker at home to kind of spy on him because he was a threat to take off. And you try doing that same kind of offense with Rosen, and it just absolutely does not work. So Mazzoni's gone, as well as the quarterback coach, who happened to be his son. They're both over at Texas A&M now. UCLA promoted assistant coach Kennedy Palomalu, offensive coordinator. They brought over Marcus Tuiasosopo from USC. He's the new quarterback coach. You're likely to see more of a pro set style offense. Mora refuses to say that. He absolutely cringes when the media calls it that because he doesn't want to label it. He says, we're just going to run our offense. Fair enough, but you're not going to be asking Josh Rosen to sprint out on every pass play. They're going to be running the ball a lot. Even though they lost Paul Perkins, they're very deep in the backfield. They got some questions on the offensive line. They lost 3 guys, and one of the replacements who was supposed to step in got homesick and transferred back to the University of Hawaii. They've got questions. That offensive line, much like USC's defensive line is going to be key, UCLA's offensive line is going to be everything. You've got to keep Rosen standing upright. There are no backups. Your next choices down are a guy who used to be a walk-on and is now a senior, and 2 freshmen, and maybe a grand total of 20 passes thrown by the backups total ever in college. So the key is to keep Rosen standing upright. Defense will be good. They lost a few key players, but they'll be good. There'll be a big change in wide receivers. They were a little bit thin, so they took one of their defensive backs, Ishmael Adams, moved him to wide receiver. That's a win-win because out of the group of defensive backs, he was probably the weakest link. So it actually shores up your defensive backs into a solid 4 guys who are going to be out there all the time and gives you depth at the wide receiver position. So it's going to be all about that offensive line and providing some protection in a pro-style offense for Rosen.
Yeah, so you've got to pick a winner here of the division.
I mean, it's going to come down. It's going to come down to that 3rd week in November where they play each other. It's at the Rose Bowl this year, if that's of any value. I give UCLA a very, very, very slight edge, and people who know me well enough are going to say I'm now being a homer. So I'm going to give them a slight edge. because the quarterback play and the running back situation and the wide receiver situation, they're shored up a little bit more than USC is. Not by a lot, by just a hair, but it's enough to make a difference.
So you were talking about Jim Mora's seat is going to be warm. Is there a coach that you think is on the hot seat for sure?
You know what? I think when you go through the conference, I think a lot of questions are going to be asked about Todd Graham at Arizona State if he doesn't have a good season. And part of that is, and Graham acknowledged that a little bit, not so much that he's in trouble, but that he's got to kind of change his mentality. Arizona State was picked to win the South by a lot of media, a lot of people last year. And Graham acknowledged that, they went into Pac-12 media days and even to the season with a lot of swagger, a lot of bravado last year. And then they wind up finishing 6 and 7 overall and 4 and 5 in the conference. They weren't all that. They weren't even close to all that. And he said, I've got to come back and think about what mistakes we made last year and fix it and do it in a year where we've got to replace a lot of players. The offense lost 9 players to the NFL, guys who were either drafted or signed as undrafted free agents. They lost their quarterback, Mike Bercovici. They lost their offensive coordinator, Mike Norvell, who's the new head coach of Memphis, and he took 2 assistants with him. So, again, not to be repetitious, but I'm gonna repeat myself. Quarterback is everything for him. He's got a redshirt freshman, Brady White, who was a 4-star recruit 2 years ago out of Southern California, or a sophomore in Manny Wilkins, or another redshirt freshman in Bryce Perkins, and they have a grand total combined 0 passing attempts in college football. And so he knows now he's got a good running back coming back in Demario Richard, who ran for 1,100 yards last year, but he knows that he doesn't have all the weapons, and even when he did, they didn't live up to their potential or up to expectations. So, he says he's not even going to name a starting quarterback until the first week of the game, or week of the first game rather, because I think he's trying to hold everything in, circle the wagons around a team with some question marks, and kind of try to keep everything as us against the world as he possibly can, because I think there are going to be some serious questions if he doesn't do better.
Anything on Arizona and Colorado before we get to the big question?
Yeah, I think, you look at, Arizona, again, Rich Rodriguez, like I said, he comes up to media day and says, no, I'm not happy to be here. I'd rather be on vacation. And, I get that. They went 3 and 6 in conference last year. I'm sure he needed the time off. They lost 4 out of their last 5 conference games. They had 7 wins, but 3 of them were out of conference wins against the powerhouses, Northern Arizona, Nevada, and University of Texas San Antonio. So he's got his hands full. He's got his starting quarterback returning, which in this conference sounds great. A new Solomon is going to be back, but he made it clear he is not handing the job to Solomon. He thought Solomon was very inconsistent last year, and he threw for 2,600 yards, but a third of that was in those 3 out of conference games against our Sisters of Mercy. And so he didn't think he was consistent enough, and he's opening it up to sophomore Brandon Dawkins, who, last year as a freshman didn't get a lot of playing time, threw like 38 passes total, 2 TDs and 2 interceptions. But he made it clear a new Solomon has to come back and win the job. They've got some decent receivers, Trey Griffey, Ken Griffey Jr.'s son, for anyone who doesn't know that, and Samaje Grant. So they've got some skill. He also, though, replaced 3/4 of his defensive coaching staff. He was just not – they've been bend but don't break for a long time, and last year they started breaking. And so he replaced or reassigned 3/4 of the staff. He brought over Marcel Yates, who was the defensive coordinator at Boise State. And so, we'll see. Again, he's got a lot to prove. The expectations aren't as high and haven't been as high over the past 2 to 3 years as they have been across town at Tempe for Arizona State. So he's got a little bit of cushion. His schedule is not particularly challenging. He plays BYU, and then he's got Grambling in Hawaii. So, it's not nearly as challenging as some of the other schools. You look at SC, and SC opens up against Alabama in Arlington, Texas, for goodness sake.
Oof.
You know, that's a tough one. UCLA opens up on the road at Texas A&M. You know, and then they've got to travel to BYU a couple weeks later, and then they've got Stanford at home in back-to-back weeks. So, you know, there's some pretty grueling schedule stuff going on with a few of these schools, and you know, Arizona doesn't have that. So if he's going to make some inroads, this is the year he's got to do it. Colorado, you asked about Colorado is just Colorado. I mean, again, like Oregon State, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but your starting quarterback, Seifu Lufau, missed all of spring rehabbing from a foot injury, and the word is he's still not completely healthy as we sit here going into the first week of August. The only speed they had on the outside, Nelson Spruce, is now in the NFL. So, you know, they lack depth up front on both sides of the ball. I guess if you're looking for an upside to Colorado, is that they only lost by an average of 5 points to Arizona, Utah, UCLA, and USC. 4 games that they were within reach. So as an old friend of mine likes to say, you can't fall off the floor. You know, you've hit bottom. The only place to go is up, I suppose, if you're Colorado.
All right, well, here comes the big question. You have Stanford and UCLA in the championship game.
Mm-hmm.
Who you got winning?
Stanford. And I don't even pause to say it, because part of the problem with the Jim Mora era, if you are a UCLA fan, is their failure to beat Stanford and their failure to beat Oregon in critical games. And Kevin Hogan, remember we talked about him as the Stanford quarterback. Kevin Hogan, if you can think about this, actually beat UCLA 5 times, because there was one year where he beat him twice, in the regular season game and in the conference championship game. UCLA historically is not physical enough to play with Stanford. They're not physical enough in the trenches, and with questions on their offensive line this year. If it winds up being a UCLA-Stanford game, I don't hesitate to say it's Stanford.
So I had a question here, and now I forgot. So how do you? Oh, sorry, this is what it was. They missed the playoff last year. They make it this year?
I don't think so. I think that there are, because I can see them having 2 losses, you know, still being good enough to win the conference. But I think, you know, when you look across the country at Alabama, at Clemson, at Oklahoma, at Ohio State, even some possible teams sneaking in from those conferences, if those teams fail, you know, if you can see a Florida State or an LSU even creeping up, I think Stanford's got their work cut out for them. I think, again, when you're looking at that stretch of 5 weeks, if they come out of that perfect, sure, yeah, great, they're in. But I think it's nearly impossible to come out of that 5-week stretch completely unscathed. I think for them, it's about hanging on to win the conference, you know, getting a good bowl bid, going to the Rose Bowl, whatever it may be. And if you're Stanford, look, that's great. I'm old enough to remember when Stanford was a bottom feeder in the conference every year. And what Jim Harbaugh created and what David Shaw has continued to foster, I think is nothing short of remarkable for a school that will not relent on its academic standards in order to let athletes in and to be as good as they are. I think going to back-to-back Rose Bowls is certainly nothing to be ashamed of whatsoever.
No, certainly not. And, I mean, do you think Christian McCaffrey is going to get Heisman consideration this year?
Look, there's a lot of talent, and people across the country listening to your show are going to tell me all about Deshaun Watson at Clemson and all about Cook at Florida State, and I do not even begin to question that they are fabulous. What I am saying is that Watson may be the best quarterback in the country. Cook may be the best running back in the country. McCaffrey is the best player in the country. There's nothing McCaffrey cannot do. Again, you know, without even going through the stats, running back, wide receiver, kickoff returner, punt returner. Heck, he even threw 5 passes last year, and one of them was a touchdown. He is the best player. And to me, he should have won the Heisman last year. If he has stats anywhere near this year, anywhere near what he had last year, I don't see how you keep him from it. I really don't. He deserves it.
All right, Tony, you have answered all of our questions here. I want to thank you so much.
Sean, I'm glad to do it. No, always a pleasure to join you.
Well, you have a good night, sir. And
right.
it was
right. We'll
our
talk
pleasure
again.
to have you.
All right. Thanks, Sean. Take care.
You too. Bye.
All right, that was Tony Siracusa talking all things Pac-12 there. Randy has joined us in the middle of the interview, so he gets to do the final standings with us here. Randy, I mean, you have to hear a lot about this conference where you live, so you kind of have a unique perspective on it. I mean, you agree with what he was saying here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you said, I caught the middle part of this, so I missed out on a few teams that he talked about. But one team I think actually jumped in right as he was talking about Washington State. And I think he said a lot of what I agree with. You know, their offense is very high-powered. Going to a few of their games over the last few years, it's always an entertaining game because you know a lot of points are going to be scored. They just have to really work on the defense. And that's kind of the way I see a lot of the Pac-12 is, I mean, you have a team like Stanford that, you know, has been, for the most part, known as a defensive style team, and the rest of the conference is more offensive-based. And now, over the last few years, you know, teams are trying to find that perfect middle ground, and this, out of all of the major conferences, I think will be the toughest one to predict for us.
Gary?
Yeah, I totally agree on predicting. It's going to be really, really difficult because there are teams in this conference that just can sometimes surprise you, come out of nowhere. I've been following Washington State for a long time, Stanford as well. I mean, these are teams that, you know, you kind of, you know, put them in the back burner because, you know, you got the SEC teams and other teams out there that you kind of really do focus on during college football. But these are the teams that sneak up, and these are also the teams that, you know, can pull a rabbit out of a hat, and the next thing you know, they're contending. So, I mean, it's going to be tough. I mean, there's some teams here that I'm looking at, I'm like, I don't know. They're either fourth or number one.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, yeah. So I don't know if there's any like super standout teams. Like we'll get to the standings that we have here shortly, but I'm kind of with him where I don't see a playoff team coming out of here. Not because, you know, the Pac-12 is down. It's just they're so clumped together and they're going to beat each other up. But I can guarantee you the fourth place team in either of these two divisions would probably beat the fourth place team on any of the divisions in any other conference. Like, I think the Pac-12 is more stacked than most, but it's so balanced, it's really tough to get that standout team like you have elsewhere with the Clemsons and the Alabamas and the Ohio States. You know, this one's a lot more even keel, which is going to make for wonderful games in the Pac-12, but is going to cost them when it comes down to playoff time, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to dispute. This is his forte, is that he would know this conference better than anybody, and I'm going to trust what he's saying here. Just, I mean, heard a lot about Washington supposed to be stepping up this season. So if they're stepping up, and Stanford and Oregon have been the standard bearers for so long, and Washington State's supposed to be right underneath them, I mean, you got a top four right there in the North Division, and then you go over to the South, you got UCLA and USC doing their thing, and I mean, I don't think Utah's going to be too far off either, so you've got three there, and I mean, so that's hard enough with those teams. They're going to beat each other up, and like you said, Randy, at first I was there going, oh man, Pac-12's got to get a team, but then looking at all the teams that they have to play each other, and one of them's going to knock each other into getting a loss. So, I mean, you guys know what we got to do right now. We got to make those standings. So, Gary, what do you think? 6-1 here on.
Go with Randy first because I'm still making my mind up.
Okay.
All right, we doing North or South first?
Go with the North first.
All right, let's go with the North. Probably the one I'll pay more attention to just because people around here are very much into Washington State. I live probably 40 minutes away from there. We'll start, I think, the easier one, Oregon State at number 6, California at number 5. And like you said, it's going to be those 4 teams kind of up in the front. I'm going to put Washington State at number 4. Yes, I totally agree that their quarterback, Luke Falk, is going to be a blast to watch, and he's going to be great. I worry about the defense, and they're going to give up a ton of points. I don't think they're balanced enough just yet, but a good step forward. I do have Oregon at number 3, taking a step back. I'll bite into the hype here with Washington. I mean, I'm going to have to see it to believe it for them to be able to beat Stanford, who I think is now the standard bearers here. But Washington, I think, out of these 3 teams behind Stanford, has the best chance to knock off the Cardinals. So I'll put Washington 2, Stanford number 1.
Looking at this, and it's like we talked about, it's so hard to make up my mind, and I really want to buy into the hype even more than Randy. I mean, I want to go all the way to the top with these guys, but I can't. But I'm going to start at the bottom and go to the top. Oregon State, I just don't see a whole lot going for them. California, I think, will be my number 5. I think California will find ways to surprise people. Following that, I'll go Washington State. I mean, they're a team that I think could even be higher if they just have some things fall their way. Oregon is not the same team as they were when they were winning lots of national titles, things like that. So I feel like they've got to fall to 3. And I'm going to be like Randy. I want to put Washington at 1, but I can't. They'll have to be at number 2, and for me, Stanford is still, for me, at number 1.
Yeah, I think we're all going to have the same sort of standings here. Oregon State, California, 6 and 5. I got Washington State 4. I think Oregon, even though they got the quarterback situation kind of in flux, I think they've got too good of a team not to at least be in 3rd. I'm going to buy into the hype a little bit like you guys. Washington 2nd and Stanford in 1st. So there goes the North Division. I think the South a little bit easier to pick. I'll go ahead and go Colorado, Arizona State in 4th. I think Utah's in 3rd. I'm going to go with the sure thing, and when you talk about sure things on quarterback, offensive side, that's where I'm going to lean to. So I'm going to go USC 2nd and UCLA 1st. Because, yeah.
I think you could be onto something there. I think definitely Colorado has even number 6 for me on that, and I just not seeing a whole lot there. I think Arizona State for me is number 4. I think Arizona is going to find a way to sneak in some wins and just hop above them at number 3. And for me personally, Utah did such a great job last year. It's hard. It really is. But USC, continually tries to find ways to win. You know what? I think I'm going to have to just put them at Utah number 3, USC number 2, and of course UCLA 1.
I just sat there and talked about how the Pac-12 was going to be tough to pick, and we basically all picked the same. I think other than Gary switching the Arizona teams. I'm with Sean here with Colorado 6, Arizona, then Arizona State, Utah, and I'm the same way. Just Josh Rosen puts it over the top for me, so I have UCLA winning it over USC.
And I was so bad, wanted to find a way to put Utah higher because, they had such a great year, last year. It's just, I can't. There's not enough proof in that pudding.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that, Gary. You kind of got to go with what you feel comfortable with. You're making picks that they gotta last the whole year. So, you don't want to be totally off the ballpark here. So now we got to pick who's winning the conference.
Yeah, give me Stanford here. UCLA is the Georgia of the West Coast. They always find a way to mess things up. And Stanford, again, is kind of the standard bearers for the Pac-12 now. So I will have Stanford winning.
Yeah, you know what? I've got to agree, Randy. And, I really, once again, I want to pick UCLA, but they lost some pieces that I don't think are going to keep them at the point that they were even last year. So, yeah, Stanford seems more consistent. I'm going to go with them.
I'm going to have to go with Stanford. I almost wanted to go with UCLA, but yeah, I gotta go with the team I trust more here in Stanford. So, all right, well that does it for us talking. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, do either of you guys think that that the team will make the playoffs from the Pac-12?
I think it's hard for that. I just think they're gonna lose too much.
Yeah, I'm the same.
Yeah, I mean, if they weren't beating themselves up the entire year, we could be, happy to say yes. But I mean, I think we're all in agreement that this conference alone has so many teams that are very even at points, and it's just going to be too tough for them to make it out of that war.
Yeah, very true. So, without further ado, I think that's it. We have talked about it. Again, thank you to Tony Siracusa for giving us that great interview.
Yeah, Tony was awesome.
And, that's 2 for 2 on great interviews from him on this. And we'll be getting some more of the last word guys when we get into the Big 12s and SECs and everything. So we still got, they've been switching his schedule at work like crazy. So I think we're finally going to get him to talk Mountain West, and I'm going to have to grab him to talk about, I think the next team is another one of these smaller conference teams. I don't have the schedule in front of me. So we'll just have to leave it at that. You'll at least get Mountain West. I don't know about the other team or other conference right now. But, so that's for college. For the NFL, we're going to be doing the NFC West. So,
your next one on Monday is the MAC.
All right, so we got the MAC and Mountain West. So hopefully Brandon will be good to go for both of those. If not, at least we got the Mountain West, and we'll have to push the MAC for another week, and maybe do 2 for one of these times. But so we're doing the NFC West on the Friday morning show for the NFL. So, we got Seahawks, 49ers, Rams, and Cardinals. So, the Cardinals is going to be tough to find for me. And I think I've got everything else, though, other than the Cardinals. But, so, yeah, I look forward to those interviews. And then, of course, us trying to figure out who's going to win, even though it seems like we should kind of know who's winning those. But, yeah. All right, everybody. Make sure to check out the WTM Network with all of the other shows on it. We are now doing, and for the NFL ones as well, it won't be immediate because I actually have to go through and clip our analysis stuff together. But for the NFL ones, until the start of the season, where there will be full shows because we won't have the interviews as much. It'll be just more of us doing the podcast. We will be doing at least video versions for the NFL division breakdowns, at least. So the NFC will have video versions of all of our analysis will be smacked together, and you'll get it on video of us. So, get to see our ugly mugs.
Yeah, sorry, Gary, you have to put a shirt back on.
Oh, come on, guys. All right.
Yeah, Gary was telling me he just couldn't stand it when we were doing the wrestling podcast. He had to have shirt on.
Exactly. Yeah. I usually, by the time we get, to this time of the evening, I usually at least have my shirt off and sometimes my pants. So.
Pants are optional. They can't see that. So.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
the only issue is, sometimes I stand up to get a cup of coffee or something like that. So.
You'll never know what you're gonna get here.
You don't.
Football doesn't
No,
matter.
you don't. So, yeah. Well, Randy, I mean, do you guys have anything nailed down as far as a date yet? We're getting into August.
I think
The
it's
fantasy
we're
show.
getting ready. These next 2 weeks we're doing practice ones. We were supposed to get together today, but every electronic that I have touched today has broke. So we were unable to get together today, but we're doing 2 practice ones, and then I think it's, let me double check the date. I want to say August 15th. It's either August 15th or August 22nd. I have to double check on that stuff. It's August 22nd will be our first full show, and we will be Mondays and Thursdays from then on point.
Well, you guys, of course, are welcome to do video stuff too. If you want.
One step at a time. I gotta figure out how to unbreak my computer.
That would be
first.
That's an important thing. To not break computers. I had to figure that out as well. With all the why the AFC East show was late and everything is because it wasn't my computer. It was the internet for some reason was being weird, and I don't know if it's because I slightly defragged my computer or I did some kind of disk cleanup or if the internet just regulated itself after Comcast did like a zillion resets. Whatever it was, finally got it to work, so now we can do the podcast like we normally do. But yeah, everybody, thank you for listening, and we'll be back on Friday with NFL, and of course the next Tuesday with the next college conference that we're previewing. So, see you later, everybody.